Welcome to episode 2 in the Yankee Air Pirate Training Series. Today, we're operating out of Tapao Royal Thai Naval Air Base, 70 miles southeast of Bangkok on the shores of the Gulf of Thailand. Tapao was famously the home of Strategic Air Command's B-52s and KC-135 refuelers. Tapao began life as a small airfield for the Royal Thai Navy, but in October 1965, the U.S. Air Force began major expansions to support its in-flight refueling missions. The new 11,500-foot runway was opened in July 1966, and would remain SAC's main forward base in the Vietnam War until U.S. withdrawal in 1973. The goal of this mission is to practice approach and landing with limited external visual information. We begin just south of Tapao, over the Gulf of Thailand. It's a very dark night, and we can see some bonfires scattered around, and off to our right are the lights of the city of Revamp. I've paused the game with Alt-P so that we can go over our landing briefing without being rushed. First thing I'm going to do is turn on our nav lights with Control-L. Press it once to set it to flash, twice for steady. With flash on, once I unpause, we'll see the top and bottom beacons begin flashing. From underneath, we can see some red night lighting in the boom operator's station, as well as the pilot director lights along the front of the belly. Those lights, also known as PDLs, provide position information to pilots refueling at night, so they can hold their position in the dark. Landing can be one of the most difficult parts of flying, but is essential because what goes up must come down. It's generally considered good form to have the number of landings in your logbook match the number of takeoffs. But night landing is even harder because of the limited visual information, and since a pilot is only as good as their last landing, this mission is going to help us practice those skills. We'll be making a visual night approach with no help from ILS needles. We're at 2,000 feet and around 200 knots with the runway lined up ahead of us. We're going to continue towards it holding 2,000 feet until we reach 190 knots, then drop the gear and flaps and begin a 700 feet per minute descent. One of the dangers of night approaches is the black hole effect. When an airport has few ground features or lights around it, pilots tend to fly lower approaches. The bright runway lights, surrounded by darkness, creates an optical illusion that can make you feel like you're higher than you actually are, and if you aren't careful, the darkness sucks you in and can cause you to crash short of the runway. In real life, we use guidance lights next to the runway to help us correct our approach angle. The VASI, or Visual Approach Slope Indicator, uses red and white lights to keep the pilot on target. The VASI here doesn't work like we normally expect it to, as the lights don't change color, but it still can be a little helpful. The red lights should just be touching the top of the white when you're on glide slope. If the red and white overlap, you're too high. And if there's a large gap between them, you are too low. The lights aren't really well defined from a distance, so you can't tell what they're actually reading from far away, so it's more of a last-minute check as you get in close to the runway. For additional help, you can turn on the in-game heads-up display by pressing Alt-D. Here in this training mission, the waypoints are set up to keep you on the approach, so following them will lead you right down to the runway in the correct position. Use these waypoints a couple of times to get a feel for what the picture of the runway looks like in the windscreen when you're correct. Then go back and try turning the HUD off and using only your eyes. Let's go ahead and get underway now. As I said, I'm going to hold 2,000 feet and let the speed bleed down to around 190. We'll drop the gear and one-notch flaps and then begin the descent at 700 feet per minute. I want to make the final approach at 160 knots, gear out, full flaps. Notice here that the airspeed indicator is reading around 20 to 25 knots faster than the real speed reported by the HUD, so I'll be aiming for just under the 200 mark on the gauge, which is the large hash mark at the top of the white arc. This airplane has a tough time slowing down, especially once you get into the descent, so make use of the air brakes if necessary. Don't dive at the runway. You'll never be able to bleed the speed off in time to touch down softly. Instead, hold the nose high early on and let it settle into a descent, using gear, flaps, and air brakes to slow down. As we're coming in close, Aim for a spot just beyond the green threshold lights, and as we flare we should touch gently down in the touchdown zone with the heavy rubber skid marks. To save the brakes from overheating, we're going to use the KC-135's thrust reversers to slow down. They're mapped to the thrust vectoring in the game, which by default is Control plus or minus. Let's go ahead and unpause now, again by pressing Alt-P. Okay, here we go. Throttles are idled, down at 0%, and I'm pitching the nose up to keep us level just under 2,000 feet, to bleed that speed off. There's 190. Pitch up just a little bit. Alright, we're going to drop gear, and 1-notch flaps down to takeoff flaps. Landing lights come on as the gear locks down. And we're descending a little bit, but I'm still pitching up because I want to get just a little more speed bled off. Flaps coming to landing as we cross under 170. So now I want to begin my descent. Let's let the nose come down. We'll drop down to 700 feet per minute on the vertical speed indicator. Speed is at 160 knots, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the in-game HUD off. Again, that's Alt-D, Delta. And you can see the airspeed indicator is just under 200, so we're going to keep it there for the rest of the approach. Keeping an eye on the VSI, the 700 feet per minute is just a guide. From here we need to adjust up and down as necessary to keep us on the profile, on the glide slope. We've got trees off the end of the runway here, so we especially don't want to get too low, because we don't want to clip those suckers on the way in. Okay, so just holding the center line here. Coming down, the VASI lights are just becoming visible off to the left side of the runway. Red over white. We're looking good. Again, aiming for a touchdown spot just beyond the green lights. And as we come down, we'll idle the engines, flare, and we should touch down just around that black spot just beyond the numbers.
Ramrod 1, tower, wind 180, at 5, runway 18 in use. Ramrod 1.
There we go, begin to pitch up into our flare. Idle engines.
Clear to land.
And VSI almost 0 as we touch down. Air brakes out. We'll do Control plus for a few seconds on the thrust vectors and then give it some throttle. And so now we're reversing thrust. Throttles to idle. Control minus will bring the thrust vectoring back to normal. And that's it. We have successfully touched down and we're rolling out to the end of the runway. We'll bring the flaps in, bring the air brakes in, and we'll taxi down to the end and get clear. One thing to keep in mind here is that this is set up specifically as a training mission. You'll find coming home from real missions that the landing waypoints are nowhere near the runway and they're not set up along the glide slope, so you can't rely on them to actually land you. They're presented here as a training aid only, but it's not what you'll encounter out in the real world. So that's why it's important to run this mission a couple of times if you're not very confident with it, to get your skills up, and then you'll be able to do it without the aid of the in-game HUD. Also, you'll find that some aircraft are equipped with ILS needles, and you can always use that to help guide you in, especially in bad weather or nighttime. We're taxiing down the flight line now, looking for our ground handler and his lighted wands. We're going to taxi in, shut down, and that's going to conclude Training Mission 2. We'll move on next to Training Mission 3, which is going to cover much more advanced carrier landings.